It's summer, it's nice out, we want to get outside and enjoy nature, but we're texture artists. Our skin is too pale, we burn easily, so we stay inside and we make nature on our computer so we don't have to go outside and deal with all the gross sand and bugs and stuff like that. I actually saw this tree for real outside, so I do go outside occasionally, and really like the look of this bark and thought it'd be really fun to make a texture out of it. Something that happens to me a lot, actually. So I took these photos and brought them in and we built this bark. Now today, what we're going to go through in this video is making the initial kind of bark shape, which I find really interesting. There's a lot of really fun tips and tricks there, and really a lot of cool opportunities to do some fun stuff with bevels and FloodFills, and it's a really cool initial shape. It's also sort of just a good generic bark. Like, the material I ended up making here is a very specific tree, my tree, the tree I found outside. But at the point we're going through in this video, it's going to be very open to any kind of bark. So the techniques you learn here are very useful for any kind of tree bark surface you want to make, for the most part. The other thing we're going to cover in the video today is how to make the moss strands. So that stuff's really fun. It also gives us an opportunity to hop into spline nodes, which we've never done before. In particular, it allows us to use the new spline on spline nodes, which are new as of like the beginning of this year. And they really open up a ton of room for making kind of vegetation assets like that. So the moss is a perfect opportunity to get into that. This graph, obviously, is enormous. The whole graph is really, really big. It's not the biggest I've done for sure, but it's about a 10-hour process. So we're not going to do the whole thing today because this would just go on forever and ever. So if you'd like the whole video where I go node by node, explain what I'm doing at every single spot, do all of the color, do all the roughness, all the fun stuff, that's available on the Patreon. That's linked in the description below. Like I said, it's 10 hours. So if you have the patience and the aptitude for that, or the want to do it, then that's a good spot to hook that up. You also have access to the graph if you want to follow along with each step and just see what I did where. But for today, let's focus on that main cool bark shape and generating that moss. And we can worry about all that other stuff some other time. So let's just hop in. Let's work on the bark first, and then we'll move into the moss shapes. All right, so the first point of order here is to make these just the general bark shape here. And we can look at our reference here. It's mostly kind of squared off each sort of panel here, or segment of bark, the layers, I suppose, and they stack on top of one each other. And they're generally square and they're generally longer than they are wide. So that gives us some, easy hints as to how we should start figuring this out. So what I started with was to take a gradient linear 2, level this in a bit, and I'm going to blend this over with a gradient linear 1. And I'm just basically rebuilding we want a gradient that goes both ways, like this. I'm going to turn it on its head here. And what we're trying to do is rebuild that square shape, but where we can customize each side of it. So if I pull this out, something like this, and then we multiply these, I inverted the connections there. You can always do that by just selecting two inputs, the nodes, and pressing the X key. Not that it matters, I'm about to multiply these, so it doesn't matter a ton. I might actually min them. I like having that slice better. Multiply would probably work too. But this is just kind of, this is like the most simple version I can make of that initial bark shape we're going to scatter around. We're going to do some stuff to it too. Something I like to do just so that these blend a bit better as well is to take a gradient linear, although we probably already have one. We haven't used a normal gradient linear 1 yet. So put this here and put it on multiply. And I like to set this to auto levels just because we've done a bunch of math to this shape and I don't know if we have full white anymore. It doesn't look like we do. So if I click on my histogram in the 2D viewport here, I'll see that, yeah, like we're basically stuck at almost middle gray. Right around here, we'd have nothing brighter than this. That's what all these barred out crosshatched lines mean. So I'm going to make sure we have an auto level like this. And this is very, very basic form of our shape. I'm not crazy about having that highlight there where we have this really sharp edge, because we're ultimately going to make a curvature map out of this. So that will be an issue, and I'll show you why once we actually build it out. But we're just going to scatter these guys all around. So I'm going to find some amount of this I like. There's something I kind of stress in all of my tutorials, and we talk about it a lot on the Patreon. in every big tutorial I've done, is I'm going to try to never, I don't think I have to try, I don't think I ever will, give you guys a random number. Or not a random number rather, but a special number. Like a magic number that makes stuff work. I'll say, hey, make sure you have a slope blur put at 0.013. Like that's not helpful, in my opinion. I'm going to tell you generally what I'm looking for. And then you can kind of find the number you like. So what I'm looking for is just a good amount of bark here, where we have a decent amount vertically and decent amount horizontally. There's no like magic way of doing this. You don't, if you would like to, you can copy exactly the numbers I'm picking, but I don't think it makes a ton of difference. And then what I'm doing down here is the scale random on the tile samplers. We talked about this a lot in our tile sampler walkthrough video. Anytime you have a random slider like this, whether it's random position or random scale or random rotation, it works. It applies a random scale to each pattern in this case, but the randomness isn't exactly what you expect randomness to look like, because it's just applying, it's a coin flip for each instantiation of the pattern, what size it's going to be. And if you have enough of these, it doesn't really feel very random. It just feels evenly spread out. We don't have like a chunk of the page where things are really big and a chunk of the thing where things are really small. It's kind of like a 50-50 chance whether you'll be big or small. So I prefer to drive the scale with something like a scale map. So we're going to plug in a texture where it's white, it'll be bigger, where it's black, it'll be darker. I prefer it that way because you can just get more of what you'd expect random to feel like. But whenever I get clouds 2, it's also a very, very bright texture. No matter what seed you pick up this, actually, it's often extremely bright, right? So we're missing a lot of dark values and a lot of dark values here and some bright values up top. So I normally auto level this to at least fill the histogram scan out. And then I'd like to take a level and just balance this, so we have a bit more of a bell curve. And then if you put this into, you can also, if you don't want to use the histogram, the levels there, you can use the histogram equalize. And this will give you an even amount of everything. So it's up to you. I kind of prefer the bell curve here. So we put this into scale map. And for now, I'll turn the scale random off, just so we can't see it, but we can only see the scale map multiplier. And when I turn this up, this to me feels a lot more like what random is, or what I expect random to look like, where we have some areas of high density, some areas of low density, and that feels better. But I'm also going to put in a bit of the usual scale random over top, just to break it up some more. And then I'm just going to scale these up, give them some random position, give them we probably don't want rotation. We might be able to play with it later. Mask color random is helpful, just a bit. And then we probably want to scale these up so that we don't have a ton of black space left. So I'm going to go turn my scale map multiplier down a bit and turn my scale up, so everything eventually meets. And what we're ultimately doing with here is generating a black and white mask. So I'm going to make a normal out of this. I like the normal Sobo filter whenever I'm trying to generate a curvature mask, but you could use the normal node as well. It wouldn't be the end of the world. It's just a different way of arriving at a normal map. If you use the normal Sobel, I like to pair it with curvature Sobel. And what we're looking for is the concave areas. I always have to remember the spoon. The concave areas here are the black lines, essentially, are the mask we're looking for. So I take a histogram scan. I'm just going to move this out of the way for a sec and set this to 0.5 plus 1. So that seems like a magic number, but the reason why this works in this case is because on a curvature map where there's no convexity or concavity, it's gray. Where there's convexity, there's white. And when there's concavity, there's black. So if we put it to 0.5, the histogram scan, and put it just 1 over middle gray, we'll get rid of the middle gray and the white. We should be left with only the black. So in this case, it's a bit of a magic number, but sometimes you'll find that this isn't enough and you need to actually push it up a bit more to find what you're looking for. That'll probably happen to us later in the video if I had to guess. I'm also realizing now that this graph is at 512 and that's probably too small. So I'm going to go up to the parent and just change that to 2K for now. So this isn't bad, but you can see how we're getting that kind of those initial big chunks of bark. I think I want these to have more of them vertically or horizontally rather. Like that. I just want more of them going that way. And I think that will work basically okay. What we're going to do with this is eventually generate a flood fill. But for now, we're just kind of looking for these initial shapes. And I think this works fairly well. If we put this into a flood fill, right, so we did a big video on this. The flood fill is extremely useful. If you don't use it, it's, you know, really, really worth learning how this works. But this just applies, you can think of it like an ID, but it's more like almost like a different UV space to each cell. So each black and white, each white island here gets its own cell, and we can use that to drive all sorts of different effects. The issue right now is we actually have some areas where the islands aren't completely closed in. Like you can see them here, for instance, where there's it's like, you almost think of it like a maze. Like there's something that can get through here. So these cells are the same cell. We don't really want that. Same thing here. So there's some fixes you could do here. You can blur this a bit. Right, so if we zoom in, these are the areas where someone could escape from here into there. So if we just blur this a bit, it kind of mixes them together. And then we can run another histogram scan. And we can use a fairly low value. The lines get thicker, but that's okay. That doesn't bug us. And it looks like we're still not quite meeting here. We probably don't need them all to meet. That makes it much better if we look at the difference between these two. Many more of them are separated, which is nice. And it looks like we just have a couple that are going to have a lot of trouble fitting. So for instance, there's one over here. I mean, this is pretty good. And it actually might not be a problem if some of them mix. They just happen to overlay each other perfectly here. So you could just also try another random seed. That's just really unlucky. So like that's even, these are all pretty good actually. Yeah, and we could, something that would probably help that actually is add a little bit of rotation, just so that we can't ever have them line up over top of each other. So if I add a tiny bit of rotation random, that'll probably fix some of them, and it did. It fixed the one over here. But this was pretty good. I don't mind some getting mixed together because it'll just be a bigger cell. And ultimately, what we're doing with these flood fills is using them to create a bunch of different masks. So the way it's going to work at first is we just need to make, the big thing here is we're just looking for a mask that we ultimately bevel. So what I'm going to do is take these and imagine beveling this inwards. To bevel this in, right? So it's on full. So one thing you don't want to do with your bevel is just kind of eyeball it to a point where you're happy with it, because you don't know if you have full black or full white. I just set the bevel to full. Now it's really, really white, right? But we know that gap is closed. So you can go to auto level here. And if we auto level this, we know we have full black and white. And I can use a Sobel normal here as well. The Sobel normal tends to be a bit more smooth. The normal, it seems like it preserves detail a bit more. It adds more detail. Or not adds, but I guess it just, the filter is more noisy. There's less denoising in it. But I kind of want this to be fairly as clean as possible here, because I don't care about adding noise quite yet. So this is hopefully, you know, making clear what it is we're doing exactly, but there's a lot more work we have to do here. For one thing, we need to make these much bigger or smaller. Like right now, the gap between all of the, because ultimately how we're going to handle this, just as a sneak peek into the future, we're going to bevel it the opposite direction, auto level it, and then histogram scan it. This is how we're ultimately going to figure this out. Now, the problem with doing it this way is there's a gap between our different pieces of bark where the black is. So a trick to do this, we needed these lines to be thick to close up those gaps, but we can get them back. We switch this bevel to work inwards. We have to go the opposite direction. And then we make our normal map. We have our auto level, our histogram scan, we leave out. And we take a curvature Sobel. And now we've sort of taken our thick line, beveled it inward, and now the darkest point of this is going to be the area that's concave. And as a result, this is going to give us almost a perfectly thin 1 pixel line. Like this. And this will bevel much better. There's some other things you could do to this, but for now, I think this will be okay. And I'm going to bevel this one again, fully out this time, and auto level it. And then this is going to become our kind of basic bark shape. And this histogram scan is going to act as the bevel height of the individual chunks of bark. So we need another normal node. Like this. And we'll want to clean up those edges, but we'll do that later. So I'm going to make that norm map pretty strong. Again, no magic number. And that hopefully you can see kind of already how we're heading in this direction. I do want to try to take away some of these little greebles. So here's another example of when I might want to scan it higher. The issue with those greebles is that when they're here, right, they're in the texture here. And when we scan these and we get a black diagonal there, when this bevels, it adds a bunch of extra noise. You get all these, I mean, and maybe you want that, right? In some cases, this might be something you're interested in. But if we put the scan up more, we're a bit more restrictive and we lose a bunch of those. We have much smoother lines. And that works a bit better. If you wanted to be a little bit more careful about this, you could also blur it a little bit. And a fun trick is you can blur it and step the graph up, just this node, and then scan it and then step it down. And this might help smooth out that line a little. Generally, a blur, it's good to think of it as an average or a smooth. If you're coming from the world of like sculpting or something like that, a blur is very much like using a smooth tool. So it just gets rid of this just gets rid of a bit of that noise, and we'll get rid of the rest later. I'm also going to plug our height map into the height so we can see this displaced. And that's a pretty decent start, I think. Now, there's a ton of stuff we want to do to this. The first really obvious one, to me at least, is I don't think we want all of the bark segments here to be the exact same width between them. If we look at the reference, there's some parts of the bark, it's thin between sections, and some places it's thick between sections. So we need a way of making these all have a random, you almost kind of want some of this histogram scan to be thin and some to be wide. That's really hard to do. I've seen people try to like get multiple histogram scans, set them all to different settings, and then like blend all those pieces back on top of each other. To me, that's a lot of work. What I would rather do is I'm going to take this, the mask that went into our bevel, and turn that into a flood fill. And what we're going to do now is get a flood fill to random grayscale. That's flood fill to grayscale. We want flood fill to random grayscale. Put this here. We're going to close this up with the distance node. So again, in our flood fill video, we talk about this extensively, but whenever you have a flood fill, you want to get rid of these black gaps in between. So we're normally putting the whatever flood fill node we're using into the source, and then putting whatever went in to the mask input of the flood fill should also go into the mask input of the distance. Then you set the distance to only source and full. And this just ensures that we close up that black gap between the spaces. But since this is all just random grayscale values, a fun thing we can do here is if we just add these grayscale values to our beveled shape here, the histogram is going to work very differently on them. And we can pull this down and play with the histogram scan. I'm also going to set the contrast to full. And this is just going to give us a very different mask where in some cases there's quite a big space between the bark. And in some places, there's a very thin space between the bark. And that's just because we've taken these bevels that are all the same. They all go from black to white for the most part. And we've made some much brighter and some much darker. So the histogram scan works very differently on them. And that gives you a nice variety between the different sizes of the shapes, which is really handy. And you can play with that by just, if you want to have less, basically what's happening is the histogram scan sets your maximum bark width. So for instance, all of this basically. And then however much you add, the random grayscale controls the minimum width. So you can use this to find that kind of balance between the two that you're happy with. And this is something you can noodle forever. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. But it's a control you'd have for the rest of your time working on this graph. That's really nice to come back and look at. And if you have to make adjustments, you can do all that. And it's fairly simple to do. I'm going to then take a bevel again and bevel this inward, auto level it, and this will become our new height map. So I think this is a lot more interesting because now we have these pieces of bark that are like really big and chunky, and like you can see the bevel really well. And then some areas where it's quite thin. So I think that's much nicer to look at. We should probably build the kind of initial bark FloodFills, and then we'll come back and do some stuff about these lines because I think they're a little too, well, we can do it a little bit now. Like my issue with these lines is that they're too straight. We want there to be a bit more of an organic shape here. There's all sorts of different ways you could go about doing this. You could even just, you probably want to do it back, like you could even do it here. We did our initial histogram scan. It's usually better to do it after bevels. So we probably want to do it. Here's probably the best place to do it. In between these two. So I could take our initial mask here and do something like a directional warp and grab whatever, just some kind of billowy noise. So I'll grab a Gaussian noise. There's nothing special about this. I'm just looking, what I'm looking for is a noise that's sort of low frequency in big shapes. I don't want to put in something really, really noisy like a cloud. I want something that's a bit slower, where the gradients change from black to white in less time. And zoom this out and plug this into the intensity input. And if I warp this, this is just going to move the lines, give them a bit of this waviness, not make them perfectly straight. Now my stuff downstream is going to change, but that makes sense. Like maybe we decide we don't want them to be able to get that thin, right? Or they're too thick. So you'd go into your edge detect, turn how thick they can be down, and then turn their minimum thickness down or up, whatever you want. But that helps just not have them be perfectly straight. And then you could do some more too. Like you take a directional warp, take like something much noisier, like an anisotropic noise. And I'm going to make this vertical by just rotating it. And I'm going to blur these to make it slower, just like the Gaussian noise. Auto level it. I'm going to put this in the directional warp and warp this up. And it's probably a little too blurry because I want some noise in the warp. And warp it a little to the left and right too. Now the issue is we're warping this to the point that it's breaking. So we might actually want to do it to the histogram scan first, to the all black bars, and then do the bevel after. Yeah, that's better, although we're breaking our flood fill here. We have some areas that are not fully closed anymore. So I'm going to go to the histogram scan and pump it back a little so we have our separate islands. Push it back until we have most of them. We also blur it a bit more if we need to. I'm just trying to make sure we close up these shapes as best we can. There we go. Nice. So this just feels better. We have a bit more of a natural feeling to it. We don't have as much straight lines, which is helpful. And yeah, this looks pretty good. We can always go and add more, right? We can always add more disruption in between here if we'd like to. But for now, it's totally good. So to get that look, the thing I really liked about it, this is bark. Like I said, I took these photos because it's every day I see it and I thought it was really cool. It wasn't as clear on one of these ones because I don't have a video of it, a picture of it from the side, but the bark sort of curls off the bark, off the trunk, I guess. It doesn't sit flush with it. The bottom and tops kind of, because it looks like it must peel off. And I guess that's what is happening with the tree over time, is the bark layers are just kind of peeling off it over and over. So we should try to get that effect going first. The way we're going to do that is use this flood fill. And we're probably going to want to use this flood fill in a lot of different places. So what you can do is drag this off, make a dot node. So I just pressed the Alt key while I had it dragged out. And here you can name this something. So I'm going to call it flood fill 01. And what's cool is I can make another dot node. And the way I made that is I just search for dot and press enter. You can make this anywhere and select that same input. And that just allows you to send information, like almost like a radio, across the graph without having to have a big noodle dragged everywhere. So it just helps it stay a bit cleaner. I'm going to grab a flood filter gradient and set this up and down. Now, we need to close up that black gap. So we need a distance node again, but we also need the mask. So I'm going to make a portal node for the mask as well. And we'll call this flood fill 01 mask. Again, you can name that whatever you want. There's nothing magical about the name either, but just something to think about. Is having it be something you'll be able to understand clearly in the future is really important. I'm going to put this here, set it to only source, put it to full distance. And you can see this is going to help us lift these up off the page. If I multiply this, they're all going to be tilted downwards now. And I can turn the height up to make it really obvious. And the other thing I'm noticing, let's turn the height scale up. I'm also going to give myself an ambient occlusion here, just so for you guys watching, you can see the compression might be a little high on that 3D viewport. So I want you to be able to really see what it is I'm doing. So I'm going to just make a gradient map, multiply this over, just so you can see. A bit more obvious. Now, one thing you'll notice, our flood fills here no longer match where the shape actually ends. So you get this kind of, you see this situation where we get this, where if we look at the original shape, we really want the flood fill to end here, but it actually ends up here. And that's just because after we had done this, adding the flood fill to random grayscale to vary up the sizes of this and then beveled it, the middle of where these are has moved since where they were here. So we just need to update the flood fill we're using. So really after this, we should be making a new one. So once we have our new bevel here, the kind of our final bevel really, we'll make a normal sobel, get a curvature sobel, and this should be our flood fill. And you'll see the difference between using this. It's like really significant. So this one I should be able to just pull up. This will work much better. So I'm going to move these portal nodes, make a new flood fill, plug this into flood fill and this into mask. And this is considerably better, right? You can see the difference. Now it hugs it perfectly. Whereas before it did this. Right? It avoids it. We get all these weird artifacts here. So cleaning that up is a huge deal, right? Something to keep your eye on. So put this here. Excuse my voice. I'm just dealing with sore throat. So we'll take these. And right now we have the bark sort of only peeling up and away, right? So it's like just tilting like a slant, but we want it to like scoop. So what we're going to do is take these gradients down here. We don't want them to go from black to white. We want them to go from black to white to black again. So to do that, the best way to do is with a curve. So you take this, and instead of going from black to white, like it does right now, we're going to move this over to white. We're going to change where white is to be about the middle, or the exact middle. Then add another node and drag this down. And make sure we're setting our tangents to square. So now we go black, white, black, which is much more helpful. If we multiply this over, there's obviously some problems. I mean, it looks kind of neat, but now we want to do the reverse of this. We want it to punch in and then out, but right now it's out, or in, then out, then in. So we could just invert this. So that's giving us more of the look we're after. But obviously we're not crazy about the fact that it just like does a perfect arrow in. So that's really just this shape. You can think about this shape as this drawing turned 90 degrees. So if we take this and smooth it out, we're going to get a much different result. As you can see how that's starting to create that peeling effect, which is really nice. And now I don't really want to multiply this because I'm returning stuff to 0 and like really flattening it. We lose a lot of detail here because we're multiplying and there's a whole lot of 0 on this texture. If we multiply anything by 0, it's going to be 0. So we're just going to get nothing. So the way I prefer to do this is to actually not invert this and instead use a subtract. So we're still going to get 0. And in fact, I'd argue this looks worse because this is a better visual effect, but we're taking a ton of the height map below 0 here. And as a result, we get this really thick black line. So what I like to do here is take the input range of this to be, instead of 0 to 1, where white is 1 and 0 is black, I like to make it 0 to 2. So the way you can do this is take a blend node, and I'm going to make a uniform color and set it to grayscale. Make a float and set it to 2. And then multiply our height map by 2. Now, this doesn't do anything at first, and that's because we need this to be not 8 bits, like what it says here. You need it to be one of the high definition ranges. So I just picked 32-bit floating point. And now you see the multiply does do something. This guy should also inherit that. And now the subtract works very differently, right? Because we're subtracting a number between 0 and 1 from a texture that now goes 0 to 2. So whatever was white here goes to, which was 1, now goes to 2. And if we subtract 1 from it, we still have 1. So it's much less likely to go below 0. What we can also do is after we're done with this math, we can use an auto level to remap this to the 0 to 1 range. And then make just an empty node. In this case, I'm just going to use a transform 2D. And set this back to 16 bits, which is the normal the normal bit depth you'll definitely be using, just to step it back down. I think this is just a more effective way of controlling that. But now we have this nice like scooping effect, which I think is really nice. You probably also want to make this a little less severe. We probably also want to auto level it. But you can see we get this really nice kind of peeling effect where the bark sort of buckles up and away, which I think is really cool. Works really nice. So I'm going to edit my material just for a second to make the height map a little bit more intense. You can see we get this awesome kind of peeling effect. Now, I probably don't want this effect to be the same strength on everything. So I could take a flood fill to random grayscale and make a distance, plug that in, and just mask this out a bit. So if I use this as a mask, some are going to peel a lot more than others, essentially. I also think I'd prefer to have just generally more thicker bevels. So we're going to go back to our histogram scan and make it so these can be thicker and have them be less thin. So that's going back to the add. I just like having that thicker bevel generally. I don't know if I need to multiply it by 2. I could probably make it a bit less. But that works pretty well. And I think I want more of them to slope than not. Like, if I turn off the mask, they all buckle. If I plug this mask in, I don't like how so many of them turn off. So we could just take our flood filter random grayscale and make it more white than black. So take a levels and just push it so that mostly it'll be on, but in some few cases it'll be off. And I think that looks pretty decent. From here, the height scale is probably a little intense just to look at here. I'm also going to turn the strength of our normal map up a bit. From here, and I do think I actually want to have, we're losing some of that variation between the thickness. So I might go and try to add a bit more. Make some get a bit more thin. I think it's nice to have a bit more variety. Yeah, that's great. So another thing we can do is just have these have a bit of a random tilt in general. So you could take your gradient, like a different random gradient. So I'm just going to grab these two and duplicate them. And generally they tend to slope in or out. They don't really tilt to the left or right that much. So I'm just going to randomize. I'm going to just give this a bit of angle variation, but mostly keep it pointing straight down. Distance this, and then I'm going to duplicate this again. Take this flood filter gradient, make this one go up, and make sure we have a different random seed of it. So the angle random is different. I'm going to blend between these with another flood filter random grayscale. So we'll hit Control D to duplicate this. And with this one, I'm just going to histogram scan this one so that it's half black, half white. So put this to 0.5. Again, the magic number there just being 50-50. If you want, you can make it more white than black. It's up to you. Put that here. Plug this in. And this is just going to make it so that we have half of our gradients are pointing up, half the gradients are pointing down. And I'm going to take this, and before we return that to the standard range, I'm just going to multiply these, and this is just going to give them all a tint, or a tilt rather. So these all kind of tilt in slightly different directions, mostly up and down, but we can, if we want, control that by changing the angle random. The more angle random there is, the more they can tilt left and right as well. But I think that's a good kind of overview of how I set up the basic bark. Again, this is just doing the primary shapes, but we have to layer on all sorts of different shapes on top of this, which we would do in the full Patreon video. Again, that video is 9 hours long. So you see like there's a lot more to do here, but this should get you kind of started on how to think about the bark shape at least. The last thing I'll do in here is just clean up that bevel. So really, we really just want to blur just the bevels here, not the flat area. And it's mostly where they meet. So what you can do is take a normal Sobel, take a curvature Sobel, make a histogram scan of this. We just don't like how jagged this is in the middle. So if we make a mask of just where the concavity is, we can get a non-uniform blur. So this is just a blur with a mask, really. So it's going to perform a blur to the texture, but we're going to tell it where to blur and where not to blur. So if you have an invert grayscale here, this is only going to blur where there's white in this mask. So that helps smooth out this jaggedness here between the two sections. You can turn the samples up and the blades up, which is sort of like a multiplier for the samples. And that helps smooth out that middle transition. Now this is pretty tight, so I'm also going to blur the blur mask so that it's not just white or black. It sort of fades in and out a bit. And that'll help just smooth that out even more. So you can see the difference it makes in the crack here when we have this and when we don't. So yeah, I think that works pretty well. And that just gives you an idea of how to approach the bark. So another really important aspect to this material was the moss. And I could see them decently in the pictures I took of the tree I like, but I wanted to find some close-ups of it just so that'd be easier to build. I'm deciding to do this. These details are going to be awfully small at the end of the day, but still I wanted to make sure that they had this level of detail in them, even if they shrunk down. Having that detail there in kind of the base level is still really a huge value. So making these shapes, like the individual strands of moss, it was a really good opportunity to try to getting into the new spline on spline nodes. So if you've never used spline nodes, we're going to give a brief overview of how to do them. We'll likely do a full video on these at some point, make like a leaf generator or something fun. And in particular, because we're using the new spline on spline grayscale, you have to make sure you have the latest version of Substance Designer. I'm not sure which version mine is, but it's the most recent one as of today's date. So you do need it, or I guess it's not quite the most recent one because they just put out the new one, but it's slightly new. So you just want to make sure that you have the spline on spline, scatter splines on splines. This node will be really important to have. So you just make sure you have that version. But if you've never used splines before, it's really interesting. Basically, we're going to start with a spline quadratic. So this just gives you 3 points. You can move these in the 2D viewport if you'd like. You can also punch in the actual locations of you can see as I move them around, their locations move here. But what you're seeing here is just a preview. It's converting this spline. I'm also going to make this graph be 1K. It's converting that spline into pixel information here just so you can see it. So this is totally a preview. There's nothing actually here yet. These are the actual spline information that you're going to pass from spline node to spline node to tell it what to do. So it's nice. So you can click on this little, double clicking on the node should work, but also you can click on that output specifically just to see this visual preview, which is really helpful. So I'm going to make these flat. So it's just a perfectly straight line, at least for now. So I'll set both of the 0.2 coordinates to 0.5, just so that we have a perfectly straight line. And ultimately what we're going to be doing here, you can do a number of things. You can use a spline render. So this will just take all of your spline information and actually render it as a rastered image, which is kind of what's happening on the preview anyway, but you can actually make this look quite different. So you have to attach all of these, the spline chords, the spline data, and the spline amount to actually get these nodes to work. Now, instead of dragging them all over one at a time, you can press 2 on your keyboard. You can also switch it up here. You can see the hotkey. So on material mode, if you have 2 pressed, I'm not holding it, I've just toggled it on. You can drag all of them at once, which is really nice. And this node then actually just renders the spline. So you can have it, the amount of segments you want. You can change like where it starts and ends rendering it. You can change the thickness, so on and so forth. The way we're actually going to be rendering it though is using a splatter on spline grayscale. So I'm going to press 2 again to drag these all in. And what this does is just scatter a shape, sort of like a tile generator along the spline. So you can see as we move this spline, they all come for the ride. We have all sorts of fun options on the scatter on spline grayscale. We can change how many shapes there are. So you can either turn shape spacing down, or you can set it to total amount of shapes and turn that up. I don't mind just having it on shape spacing. And then you have again start, and you have a bunch of details we're going to go over here. I'm going to put it to 0 because I just want them to make a straight line. And we're going to make that central segment of moss first. So I'm going to get a spline transform. So this is just like a free transform, but for splines. And I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees counterclockwise so it's pointing straight up. Like this. And so even for that first segment, a couple things we'd want to do is we want this to be thicker at the bottom and thinner at the top. So the way to do this is you go down to the size. I'm going to switch the size to use thickness from spline. So it'll go black. That's fine for now. What we need to do is apply thickness to this spline so that the scatter on spline grayscale can use that thickness. Now, that doesn't come supplied on it. The way you do that is you go sample thickness, thickness. So you can plug these in, and you'll notice you have this thickness map. And what this does is if we put in a texture, I can rotate it 90 degrees and plug it in. I'm just using a gradient linear. I'm going to switch the sampling mode to horizontal along spline and plug this in. And now you'll see this works. I just need to turn the thickness scale down, and I want my gradient the other direction. So why is this working? So basically you can think of the spline as just having like, it has a thickness attribute that is at some value along the whole length of the spline. Putting a spline sample thickness is what will allow us to specify what that value is at different points along the spline. So when we switch the sampling mode to horizontal along spline, it's going to look at this texture and go, okay, well, you're 1 over here and 0 over here. So it'll take the spline, the length of it, and put 0 here and 1 at the other end, and every number in between. And then when we go to scatter on spline, and instead of using the size mode normal, we switch it to thickness from spline, the thickness uses that, or the size uses that thickness attribute to control how big the shapes should be. And we can multiply that here to make it stronger or weaker. See, and that's why by default this was on texture space. We don't want to do that because that just takes the texture and just, you can imagine just laying it over top. So check this out. If we have a Gaussian noise and we put this as the thickness map, look at what we get. I'll turn the scale up just so you can see it. Right? Basically what's happening, not basically, exactly what's happening. Just so you can preview it. If we have it set on texture space like we have right now, I'm just going to use this to show you. It basically samples whatever's underneath the texture at that point, and that becomes the value for the thickness. So you can see we go from like a middle gray to a black, up to a white again, to a black again, to a white, and then we end up here. So that's why when we have this set to sample by texture space, this just follows, it just goes from like black to, or white to black again, to white to black again. Like it's all loopy, right? Whereas if, that's why when we plug a gradient in, the thickness doesn't change at all. If we put on our gradient into the thickness map and keep the sampling mode on texture space, all that's happening is the thickness is staying the same. That's why it doesn't look like it's doing anything, because every value on this gradient map is the same along this spline. So that's why we instead switch it to horizontal along spline. And so that works well. I don't think we like the curve of the size here. Like it just does this linear scale down, which doesn't make a ton of sense. So what we'll do instead is make a curve node, and we can change the profile of that by manipulating our curve. Right, so it stays really wide and then tapers just at the end, for example. Right, we have a lot of control over how this looks. And we can turn the spline down a bit if we want, or the total thickness we can turn down a bit with our thickness scale. But I think that works pretty decently. I'm also not going to let them be disks, which is what they are by default. I'm going to use parabolas, and that gives us an actual kind of 3D shape. So you can see this is going to give us our actual, we'll use the 3D view later, but this gives us an actual, well, let's turn the 3D view on. There we go. This gives us a great kind of main stem. And let's make like a quick color here. I'm just going to grab like a general moss color to look at and make this way rougher. And we'll multiply this and make the, the normal map make much stronger, just so you can see it. So there's our like first stem. Pretty simple. And you have a lot of controls over here. We can just keep playing with the way that the profile of the curve changes. Right? Should it stay thicker, longer? It's really up to you. The other thing is, because we're eventually going to scatter these on the graph, we want the splines that show up, or the shapes that show up here, to be darker than the shapes that show up there. So we can actually specify the height information on the original spline. We just set the start height to 0, and you can see in the preview, it follows that. It's 0 here, and then 1 at the other end. And with that set, we can go to the scatter on spline grayscale, go down to the height section, or the color section, and we switch the spline height multiplier to full. And now the shapes get darker the lower the height value on that spline was. So you kind of have to imagine the splines carrying different attributes, like the height and the thickness. And then those can be used to drive other things down the graph. So this works as our main spline, but we want to scatter a bunch of splines off of that to create the branching fronds of the moss. So we're looking for scatter splines on splines. And this is a really fun new node. Relatively new, as of like maybe 6 months ago, 5 months ago. So we can plug in what we currently have into the spline coordinates. You can see it's scattering additional splines along that, which is really cool. If you want to see both splines at once, you can make a spline append and append our stem spline to our scattered splines. And this is really, really cool. I've been waiting a very long time for something like this. So we have all sorts of fun controls here that would make a lot of sense. So we can turn up the amount of splines. We can say, hey, where do we want them to start? Right? Should they be more towards the end? Like probably a little bit. So we have a bit of a stem. And what's cool is you can also see the splines are absorbing their height information from the main spline. Right? So these side shoot splines are staying the same color relative to the spline's initial location along the main spline, which is really, really helpful. Makes a big difference. So there's some stuff we want to do here first. We definitely don't want to make it just the left side. We probably want to do left-right alternate. A lot of vegetation does that, right? Like it alternates offsets left and right up the chain of the main stem. And we can do all sorts of other stuff here. We can go spline scale, just make them longer. Doesn't make them thicker, right? Something to be careful about is it just makes the splines actually, you can think of scale as like the length, really. It has not much to do with the actual thickness of them. We deal with that with like the scale multipliers. We also want to tilt them up. Now, that's a little bit different here because rotation doesn't really work. What we want to use is this left-right angle, like this. And what you'll see is, I'll just plug this into our scatter. You see this is working pretty well. There's some things we want to change here for sure. Right, these look kind of silly. We probably want way more of them. So I'm going to go down and turn the spline amount up. And then there's some things we want to adjust here for sure. The first thing is like these don't get thinner the further along they go. And that's just because we sampled thickness for this spline, but we didn't for this one. So I'm going to grab our own spline and put them into the custom spline coordinates. And instead of using spline type straight, I'm going to use the custom spline. So that's just going to swap out the default spline it uses to use one we specify. And what we have to do is right now they're getting their thickness from the spline beneath them, which is good. We want that, right? They should get thinner the further up they go. But these should also thin out. So what we need to do is sample the spline thickness of our newly generated splines. So we go sample thickness here. And we're going to do the same thing. And go horizontal along spline. And this sort of works, but the issue is we're sort of overriding the length of the spline or the thickness of the spline, right? It's tapering along the length, which is good, but they're really, really fat at their bottom. They're no longer doing that thing we liked before where they're listening to the parent spline for how thick they should be at their base. And so all we really have to do to fix that is we don't want to set the blending mode on this sample spline thickness to copy. We want it to be multiply because we want it to have its original thickness it got from here, but then be modified by this to be multiplied against it. And this gives us the behavior we want. We can also, if we want, just generally make them less thick. For instance, all we really need to do is make a level here. Well, first of all, we probably want to change the curve because maybe we don't like how tapered these ones get. But we can also just put a levels here and darken the whole texture. And this will just make them thinner in general, while still being related to the size of the parent spline underneath. Maybe we want them to taper a bit more. And I want them to be quite a bit longer, I think, now. So I'll go down to the scatter spline and turn the spline scale up. Cool. And that works really nice. I think this might be a little dark for everyone to see, so I'm going to brighten this up. There you go. Some things we still need to adjust. For one thing, these should rotate more up the closer they get to the top. Like right now, they all just do this. We want them to like slowly start to pinch upwards. We probably also want them to get smaller potentially, but we can adjust that later. So we can use this rotation map. And if we plug in a gradient into the rotation map here and go down to the spline rotation section on the scatter splines on spline, you can turn the rotation map input up. Now we don't want the rotation map to affect the spline rotation. We want to affect the left and right angle. And we want to sample it horizontally along the spline. And we probably want a negative value here. But we need this to be flipped. There you go. So you can see they left-right angle more the more they get to the top. So that's closer to the look we're after. Like that. Also, we probably want these to not be like poker straight. They should have a bit of a curve to them. So because we're now using a custom spline, we can take that middle of the quadratic and move it. And that's really cool. Now, we want both sides to look like the right side. Right now, they're both swaying this way. The way you fix that is you go into your scatter spline on spline and you switch the symmetry mode, left-right symmetry, to the symmetry mode you write. Like, so if you're making like something that's more like a banana leaf like I have over here, you would do this. Or you could go to left symmetry, which is what we actually want in this case. I think this looks great. And it's nice that we can actually just control the profile of that curve right here. And that's getting pretty close to what we actually want, to be honest. I'm just going to change the rotation a bit. And we don't like that they're getting so tall that they're coming over the other edge. So we could just take our main spline and scale it down. So it starts slower or lower down. And I think that looks really nice. We probably have the splines rotating in just a little too much. So I'll pare this down just a bit. And then you can do fun stuff like in terms of like usual tile generator stuff. Like you can go down, turn on a bit of rotation random. You can turn on a bit of offset, like random offset. right? So they're not perfectly alternating left and right. They actually move a little bit. So this is sort of like position random on a tile generator or a tile sampler. But I think that looks pretty neat. The other thing you can do is warp this, so it's not perfectly straight. So you get a spline warp. And this works exactly like what you'd think. We can plug in like a Gaussian noise or something, and it's a warp, but it just warps splines. Now, we don't want an attenuation curve. We want it in the intensity map. And we get this. And you can see all the other splines come for the ride too, which is really odd. Like, I've been waiting a really long time for this, so this is like really great to see. So this is cool. We're using the texture space, but we could also go horizontal along spline, just like we did before. And I think it's warping too frequently, so I'll zoom this guy out a bit. And we also I'm not crazy about how the bottom of it is moving. So you can actually go down to the start attenuation and lock it in place. So now it doesn't matter what happens with this noise. The base of the spline stays locked in place, which is really awesome. And it's probably a little intense. But this helps us get a bit more of a natural feel here. So that's a brief overview of the splines. The last thing you'd want to do here is the scatter on spline grayscale. You'll see it tends to like sit at 8-bit by default, and that's just because it's primer node. You can see it's got that little dark gray circle in it. Whatever texture is plugged into this will determine the bit depth of the node, and since we don't have anything plugged in, it just goes to 8-bit. The issue with that is that it gives us a bunch of noise in our height map because we only have 8-bit grayscale. So there's a couple solutions for this. You could, if you want to, just make a uniform grayscale or plug in anything basically that is at 16 and plug that in, and that will get rid of it because now this node is inheriting the right bit depth and we get that nice smooth result. Alternatively, if you didn't want to do that, you could just go to this node and set its output format manually to 16-bit, and that will also clean it up. So that's just a rough idea. We eventually just turned this into a generator. And what's cool is in the main Patreon walkthrough, we took this, and this is just a graph now that if we seed it, just makes us random bits of moss. So really, really cool. Like I said, was very excited for this node. I've been waiting a really long time for it. And it unlocks all sorts of things. We're probably going to do like a real like leaf generator sometime in the not so distant future. But those two parts, the bark and the moss, really do make up the bulk of how that graph worked. All right, so those are the two parts of the graph that I think are really the most kind of crucial. Obviously, in the full graph, which you can find on Patreon, we do a ton of other stuff. We have the secondary bark, tertiary bark. We're stacking in a whole bunch of other detail. We have all of the high frequency details to add, these other layers of peeling bark. We eventually have to like actually take our moss and lay them out and actually get them onto the texture. We do some fun stuff where we create some dead moss as well. And we didn't even touch on how we did the lichen. So we had to make these cool lichen patterns to put everywhere. Because I saw in the reference, this lichen would grow every once in a while. So that was a lot of fun too. So there's a lot of, and not to mention this huge chain of the albedo here. There's a lot of stuff here. So if you'd like that, I make a point of in the YouTube videos not having mid-roll ads, right? Of not having ads in the middle of the videos. I find that really, really irritating. If I'm trying to learn, I don't like, I don't have YouTube. I guess I should get YouTube Premium probably, but it just blocks me every 2 or 3 minutes. Something's taking me out of it and it's really distracting. So I make a real point of not doing that. So if you'd like to support me and you'd like to see this whole video, the best way to do that is to visit the Patreon. If you can't do that, I totally appreciate it. I hope you learned something here. Like I said, the bark stuff should be broadly useful for any kind of exterior bark you're doing, and the moss should hopefully get your heads just wrapped around the spline nodes generally. So if you liked the video, you had a good time, I'd appreciate you liking the video if you had a good time. The follow would be nice, subscribe is great, turn on the notifications so you get notified when new videos come out, all of that kind of standard stuff. Really appreciate it, but thanks so much for hanging out for this one, and we'll see you all in the next one.